welcome everybody to a little interview that we're going to be doing today with Dr. Teddy Tarr, who is a doctor of psychology and a grief counselor, and she is the mentor of a program that we started in the year 2000, and from 2000 to 2016 we were training faith-based groups in Miami-Dade, Broward, the Keys. We ended up with 90 grief support groups in faith communities, and thanks to Dr. Tarr, who was our guru and main teacher, and cheerleader, and cook, something. So we had a great time training people, and many of them are still out in the community doing that work and serving those who are grieved in our county. So welcome again. This program is sponsored by Global Grief Support Incorporated and Share Your Heart and
Crossroads?
And Crossroads. Okay. Crossroads Counseling Center. So thank you, Dr. Tarr, for joining us in this conversation. The background of it is that we, as a county and as South Florida, have experienced a collapse of a tower in Surfside, and so grief is on our minds. There are lots of people affected, and some people say that that most people know somebody or have some connection to somebody who either died or had a loved one related to the Champlain Tower collapse. So what our intention is to offer some training in grief support so that 6 months from now or so, or 8 months or 9 months, when people show up at our churches, we have some people who are trained and that can respond to providing comfort to those who are mourning. So Dr. Tarr, thank you for joining us. And my first question is, how would you describe the differences between normal grief and traumatic grief?
Well, before I start, thank you for inviting me. And we have a long history. I might add, since he talked about this 16 years at Baptist, it was his idea. I may have been along for the ride and a part of it, but it was always your idea. Dale has great ideas, and I so appreciate being part of the conversation. The difference between grief, regular grief, normal grief, and compassion for socialization for that grief, and what happens in traumatic losses. You know something? All grief is traumatic. If it's your loved one, it's traumatic. And if you're watching TV, it's traumatic. And you may not even know those people, and you're so right. The whole community across the world is focused on what's happening. And everyone is feeling something and feeling probably more losses because of it. I think if I was going to pick one thing that would change between a normal grief, I would consider an easier grief, maybe, an easier grief to manage, would be it doesn't last as long, it's expected. Someone may be very, very old, has had an illness, and they're ready to leave, they're ready to go, and they have a spiritual, they're able to talk about it, they make you feel comfortable, everybody's able to say goodbye. Those are things that make us more into a normal grieving.
Well, during a hurricane or a building collapse, or actually any natural disaster, when disaster relief organizations show up, they usually provide what is called psychological first aid. And the news organization, what you see on TV, the reporters will say, well, now we have 50 grief counselors on site, right? So my question is, are they really doing grief counseling, or are they doing psychological first aid? And when does grief counseling really begin?
They're doing grief interviewing.
Mm.
And I'm not making a judgment call on that, because that's part of the news. Are you asking me if it's helpful?
Well, I'm sure it's helpful.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I'm not sure to the person if it helps their grief or not.
Oh, because
Yeah.
they may not have started grief.
Well, I think what happens is that a lot of times they stick a mic in front of someone who's crying, who's upset, maybe hysterical, and it could be embarrassing later for that person.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what is. This is the world we're living in, and I accept that. Does that begin the process? I'd have to ask the person how they felt about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, when survivors are waiting with hope
Yeah.
that their loved ones will show up alive, are they grieving, or does grieving somehow get postponed? Do people put grief on the shelf to pick it up later?
That's a good question. I think in general, if you're standing by, your brain is saying, oh my God, this isn't going to work. Nothing's going to happen here. I'm going to be in the throngs of bereavement. And your heart is saying, I can't stand this. I can't stand this. And I have to have hope. So your brain and your heart are having a dialogue as they stand by and they're waiting for the outcomes. And I think that would be true of being by a bedside also, of people who are dying. The same kind of experiences.
Well,
You can delay it.
Very similar to that question. I mean,
Oh.
as you know, that I've been doing a lot of work outside the country, and
Yeah.
I do grief workshops. I was doing a grief workshop in Peru, and the two fishermen's wives told me how they refused to accept that their husbands had died. They were reported lost at sea, and they actually went and hired some fish captains to go out and maybe to this island or that or to this beach, and they, for a month, they were searching and they were not giving up. So they said that they refused to start grieving because they refused to accept that death had occurred. Now, grief guru William Worden says the first task of grief is to acknowledge that death has occurred. So is refusing to acknowledge that death, is that a stumbling block to doing our grief work?
Well, it's probably psychotic if you know for sure that somebody has died. That would be psychotic. In truth, what they mean by acceptance is what it means to me. What does that loss mean to me personally? That's a different kind of acceptance. Most people accept the fact that someone has died, but I'll be honest with you, if I'm on that widow's walk in Key West and I'm waiting for my loved one to come in, I'm not giving up until I see, the body.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah.
And that grief can't begin, absolutely, until that body comes ashore. But today, what we mean by acceptance is what that grief meant to me.
Right. And they often talk about we need to find the body in order to have closure. And I always question that, how can you have closure? We haven't even started grieving.
Yeah.
Right.
I think what they're meaning is a type of closure, a physical closure of some sort. I think for some of it, there's never any closure. When Kubler-Ross did all her research, she did it on a very small population. We don't go by those particular stages or phases or whatever today. And we know that some people don't, they skip all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Well, and William Worden, in his list of tasks of grieving, he describes the second task as dealing with or coping with these raw feelings, the emotions and so forth. But if your particular kind of grief was caused by trauma, as soon as you start talking about your grief, the memory of the trauma comes flooding in, and you're so overloaded with your emotions, then you can't even talk about it. You can't even get to your grief.
And you're going to have I'm sure with that building, with all the buildings, all along the coast, everywhere there's a coastline in a building, over 2 stories probably, you're going to have people who are worried. But I'm going to tell you my experiences in here. Until the legal issues are resolved, there is no closure. There has always been a need to have legal closure, no matter what that is.
And that was true. We after Trayvon Martin and
Right.
We had and after some school knife incident where somebody died in the school in Pinecrest, we started getting people, mothers, parents, to our grief support groups that were suffering because of the trauma or because of the violence, right?
Yeah.
And so
They couldn't even do the program.
right, and so we offered a new course, what we call complicated grief due to violence,
That's right.
and so the question is, how does traumatic grief impact the spiritual self, and why would you focus on the spiritual self in counseling the traumatized?
I knew you'd ask me about the spiritual self because, I've always felt that the second half of one's life, oneself is now in service to the soul. We know that. There's a lot more contemplation because we've now lived and we've achieved a lot of the material things and having a lot of the relationship questions answered. So I think that spiritual self, I call it an agent of change. It's an agent of change. And it's used to woes. It's used to reading about woes, being brought up knowing about woes. It's used to suffering in scripture. It's used to having a depth that we don't normally have when we have material ideas. So it's more value-centered. Feelings and thoughts can change over time. And they can take us over. But our value system in general is fairly consistent over time, and we tend to operate out of it. I'm not saying it never gets changed.
I remember a mother of a child that had died, who came to one of our grief support groups. She had described how all she wanted to do was stay in her bedroom, shut the curtains, keep the lights out, and stay in her room for a month, So sometimes people who are grieving, they isolate themselves.
More often than not.
And on the other hand, because of our groups that we formed, perhaps some people, instead of isolating, they find other people who have also had losses and they form what I might call a new tribe, right? Mm-hmm. A tribe of mutual
mourners.
Support of mourners, mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, one of the concerns that we hear, and certainly this will happen in a natural disaster, there are survivors who feel guilty about having survived.
Survivor guilt.
So how is survivor guilt an obstacle to doing our grief work?
I guess it has to be worked through like everything else. I think when one comes in and they come into a church or a group of any sort, and we know that socialization and compassion are probably the only things that really help us heal outside of working with ourselves, self-help. I'm a firm believer in self-help. But compassion and socialization help us a lot to thrive. They help us to thrive. Just surviving isn't really enough. In the beginning, we're a victim, and now we're surviving. But that doesn't take anything away. It's now stolen our thunder. We no longer were part of the walking wounded. In order for us to move on to thriving and then inspiring others, we've got to be able to find meaning. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe we won't have such a fun life anymore. Maybe one of the prices of a lot of traumatic events, maybe that a lot of the people who are part of that community of being on the beach, and that includes first responders.
Absolutely.
Right. It is anyone who's connected with it. People making decisions, hoping they've made the right decisions. I think one of the tasks of all of those people is to find some meaning in something so awful.
Absolutely. Right.
Mhm.
And that's
Did I answer that correctly?
well, actually, there's a series of questions that you've already started answering the next question, which is, how do you describe the psychospiritual impacts of trauma and disaster?
Well, certainly the spirit gets hit really hard, and it suffers terribly. But it's respectful, and it's patient, and it's long-suffering. The spirit has a lot of qualities that the self that's used to materialism, getting ahead, in power, those things all go by the wayside when something like this happens. They're no longer important.
Right, and we go to our value system.
We go to our value system.
And we go
To
to
survive.
our spiritual roots,
Yeah.
which is why we agreed from the beginning of our program, in the year 2000, that we would work with faith communities.
That's
A
right.
faith-based approach, because spirituality is such an integral part of doing our grief work.
And they actually had to be, I don't want to say the word screened, but they had to do an application, and you had to make sure that they would benefit from that type of group. I also want to mention, remember the Hope Chest we created? And one of the things that's important for anyone who's gone through a traumatic event is having a whole hope chest of different ways to cope.
Right. Now, as a hospital chaplain, I learned that I can't fix everything, and I'm not the go-to person for everything. That there are some times that I need to refer, and you would find, I'm sure, that in the cases that you see, you may see depression, and you may see grief. My question is, what's the difference between depression and grief, and when should I, as a chaplain or volunteer chaplain, when should I refer to a psychiatrist?
I'll differentiate. I'm not going to use the DSM-5, which would be the legalistic definition, but I do myself. Small d, depressions, not feeling good sometimes, not wanting to do anything, not highly motivated, anhedonia, things I liked before I don't like now. I'm not wanting to eat sometimes, I've lost weight or I've put on weight. Small d. Big D has to meet certain criteria, and one of the things that I would say, helpless, hopeless, hapless. Everything happens to me, I can't deal with this, I am not willing to be here. Now, not that you can't hear a threat from someone who's had a traumatic experience, you certainly can, that doesn't mean they're going to do something. But if they start selling their possessions, and they're telling you they're going out on US 1, and they're just going to lay down, they have a plan. Just crossing that street could be bad enough.
So that means a referral.
That's a referral.
That's definitely.
You know something? You have an instinctive, there's something inside you that when you sit with someone, you know when it's a case of needing extra help. And you know something, you have to be so careful, so very careful. My approach usually is one of, it sounds like this is so tough for you. And you're dealing with this all alone, even though you live in a household with 6 people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe we might be able to get a teensy medication for a while that might help you deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
So your approach, the way you frame it, the voice you use, rather than, I think you need to go to the psychiatrist and have a medication. No.
Right, yeah.
Am I correct?
I
Soft
definitely
spoken.
agree, yes, right.
Yeah.
Now, some people describe faith as helpful with coping with loss, while others feel that God is indifferent or is a hindrance instead of a source of comfort. What is your approach to counseling these two opposite clients? Those who find comfort in God on the one hand, and on the other hand, those who are angry at God or feel that God is indifferent to their suffering.
I always remember I'm not running a Bible study when I'm working with bereavement. And God does not need a defense from me at all. He does not need my defending. And in general, People who are very, very angry blame the doctor, blame God, blame anyone who happens to be in the way. That's part of what a group does. Talks about those feelings, allows them to surface, doesn't try to shut them down. Job was not a happy camper with all his losses, and you know I wrote a book about Job. I think we forget that God can handle questions. He doesn't like us when we walk away. But one of the things the church then is doing when you're bringing in people and you're not throwing scripture down their throat. If they're already a part of a church, they probably can quote the scripture as well as you can. You give them time to talk about their anger and how they feel. Just because you're angry doesn't mean you've left God. Those two things can go together.
Yes, and we've heard so many times how people early on, they're angry at the doctor, they're angry at the hospital.
You never want to argue with someone.
I'm going to get a lawyer, I'm
No,
going to sue
no.
this, I'm going to sue the school.
And I never take that on. Because your whole being is sitting there and trying to understand this has hit every single thing that person ever believed in. All the self-regulation. Normally they wouldn't say things like that.
Absolutely.
But if they're saying them, they feel safe with you.
That's a good point, yeah. Well, now, some survivors of natural disasters or man-made disasters, like a tower falling, some survivors are heroic, valiant testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit, but not everyone is so resilient.
Oh my.
Can you describe some of the factors that contribute to resilience?
You know, I went back into what I teach. I tried to think of, because I couldn't remember all of them, what the literature says about resilient folks. And this is the list that comes from the literature, and then I'll give you my list. Autonomous, people who can make decisions for themselves, don't need a whole lot of counseling. Independent of cultural influences. They don't go by how they were brought up or how their family thinks or feels. They pretty much go with their gut feelings about this. Optimal functions prior to the event. Were they functioning well before? They have a better chance of functioning with this. Management to recognize the possibility of growth. Let me tell you something. With all the events I had in my life, if one time somebody told me I was going to grow from grief, I would never have spoken to them again. That is the worst possible thing to say. But if you've been with a group and the group has moved on and the group now is looking to get back out there, they're now talking about growth. They're talking about the heart that was broken being now open again. So recognizing that possibility would be along the line, not in the beginning. Healthy psychosocial adaptation. That would be not being in isolation. Being willing to come out of that room in spite of how one feels at some point. And restoration, having a deep sense of purpose. I have always counseled people who have lost a lot of folks that the cocktail party is probably not going to serve you anymore if it ever did. You're going to need something more meaningful. You're going to have to, it doesn't mean you have to switch professions or jobs, but you're going to have to find something that is making you feel quickened, more alive, because right now you feel like you're in the same spot as the person you've lost in the grave. And you don't want to come out of that grave. And you also feel embarrassed to think that if you come out of that grave and you start doing anything, that you're going to be judged by yourself and others.
Yeah, and when I was doing a workshop in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, I remember a mother saying that she had lost her children, and she was looking around in her village and she saw lots of children who had lost their parents. And she thought, for some reason I must have survived. God must have allowed me to live. What is it? What can I do? And she began taking in children who had lost parents because that was the meaningful thing to do.
Absolutely. She found a way to compensate. It wasn't going to make her child come back at all.
No.
I've always said, my own thing was always, you can hide from life, you can never hide from death. You only have a certain number of years here, and you can decide at some point. In the beginning, no, you can't make a decision. You need help. By the way, if your inner resources are overcome, and you feel like that post-traumatic self cannot manage with what resources it has, that's when you need to look outside yourself and start finding help, a group, self-help, whatever, talking to somebody about getting help.
And you gave us the what the professionals say about resilience, and then you said, and your
And,
list,
my guts.
guts.
I was telling Dale before we started talking that I have a way of remembering how one is hit with PTSD, post-traumatic stress, or a traumatic event. And I go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, S. A, affectual, that's feelings. B, behavioral. C, cognitions. D, developmentally. E, events. F, your family and friends are all hit. G, guts. It takes a lot of guts to do this work and to help people do this work. And S, utilizing that spiritual self. Get in touch with that value system that maybe you haven't relied on as much as you could have, should have, ought have.
You know, you just mentioned the spiritual self and or
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
post-traumatic, yeah, okay, so chaplains and grief counselors who work with veterans of foreign wars talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, or PTSD. Or they also use the phrase loss of soul. Why would the traumatized say, I'm shattered, or I feel like an empty shell, or I'll never be the same? It seems like there's a new vocabulary related to post-traumatic grief counseling. Can you help us sort out some of these terms?
Frankly, I think the terms are ambiguous. I feel when you sit with someone, they're not going to use any terms. And you don't have to think in terms of terms unless you're writing some kind of report or you're in the field where you have to do that. So I'm not a big term person, but PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, whether it's wartime, this is going to be PTSD. I'm going to tell you why.
Surfside.
I'm going to tell you why. Because I would bet that a lot of young people put their parents there thinking it was a safe place, and parents put their children there thinking it was a safe place, because as I understand we have quite a variety of age groups. And friends put different people there, and people who are standing beside that pile of recovery, they're thinking not only in terms of the people that they lost that were their family, but the people that they knew. All of those people have been there for a long time. And every single place along that beach is going to have that kind of thinking. And everyone in Miami and everyone in the world. Nobody's going to forget this.
If
PTSD.
Right, that's a PTSD.
It is a PTSD. So there's going to be a disordered recovery. It's going to be avoidance sometimes and flooding, and there's no way out of it, and it's going to last for quite a while. Remember, when that is all closed up and all that is away, that is not the closure for any of those people who have lost people.
So how can a grief support group in the faith community, how can it help people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress?
If we remember that everyone who has a traumatic event, we don't judge it. Don't judge grief. Whoever's sitting there with you, they have a PTS self. They have a post-traumatic self, no matter what. It doesn't have to be a disorder. We just want to have a good listening. Let me tell you something. Active listening is the only thing that's really healing. No mouth, nothing you say is going to heal anybody. Your co-journey, being there with them, knowing what you learn from programs, if you're going to work with that population, and you're going to have a hunger. I'm going to tell you something. You work with grief, bereavement, death and dying, PTSD, traumatic events, you're going to have a hunger. You're never going to be satisfied with what you know. You're always going to be looking for more information. It is the most seductive field. And in the beginning, you think, I can't do this, I can't do this. After a while, you cannot do it. Your problem is you can't put it down.
If grief is ignored, denied, or simply not processed, what might be the negative impacts on mental health?
Oh, the worst possible condition. To live a meaningless life. To live a life that one is a part of the Walking Dead. because the brain loves complexity. If it focuses only on loss and it has nothing else, it can't self-regulate, it can't have other tasks, you have no relationships, you isolate yourself. The walking wounded in a meaningless life, the worst possible condition.
You talk a lot about grief work. In fact, that's one of your logo is like grief works, right?
Uh-huh.
Can you describe some of the benefits or positive impacts on mental health if you do what you call your grief work?
Wow. You would think that would be such an easy question for someone who's had to go through their own personal journey as well as sitting here with so many journeys. I guess the first thing I would say would be self-regulation. It allows you to begin to come back to be the person you were. That doesn't mean inside you feel that way, but at least externally you're able to do some of the things you were doing before, maybe without much heart in the beginning. But it will allow you now to step back out, not necessarily step back up. So, and it is going to be one step at a time. I think in the beginning, you recognize how much you're hurting, and you're able to start realizing that you've got to do something about it. In the beginning, you don't know you have to do anything about it. You think it's going to go away. You think tomorrow you're going to wake up and you're not going to have this. And every single day you wake up with the same feeling. Why? The dread is there because we have invested so much in those we love. And in our children, even more. We've invested all the things we didn't have in childhood, all the things we weren't able to do in childhood. So we have a tremendous investment. So in the grave is part of ourself. So now we've got to take the first step would be to own that this is ours. This is our cross. And as much as we hate it, we've got it. And the second step would be, okay, what's my plan here? In the beginning, I can only mourn. I'm hit with the grief, which I'm very reactive, and now I can only mourn. How do we mourn? We mourn culturally the way that we've been taught to mourn. We're part of a group. We go to mass, or we go to meetings, or we do whatever. And when people ask us, how do you feel? What do we say? We're fine. How are you getting along? Okay. Because we don't want any input. So the third step would be that we start being able to open up and accept that others care about us, that they're not always going to say the right thing.
And welcome help.
Welcome the help we need. Well, I think even in step 2, we start doing that. But we have to recognize what that loss means to us in order to heal.
When I got out of 4 years of seminary, and I went to my first church in Milwaukee, and it seemed like people were waiting to die because I was doing one funeral after the other. And then I looked back at I had one course on pastoral counseling, and of that whole course, we spent like one session where we talked about grief. And I felt totally inadequate in terms of in terms of 4 years of seminary, but I felt unprepared, right?
Sure.
Well, I wonder what would you recommend to a volunteer chaplain or faith leader regarding when to refer a client to a grief counselor or post-trauma therapist?
Well, I think whatever you're doing yourself, now let's say you're running a group and you're a novice, that's probably a better place to be because the group will teach you. You'll learn from the group. You don't have to be so wise in the very beginning.
And this is why we so much value the group process.
Yes.
Group support.
Absolutely. And a basic classes. The more you read about, the more you learn. The more you learn what not to say. What not to say is more important than what to say. You're not going to say much. People are looking for a target when they're in bereavement. And you don't want to be that yellow and black target, that says something like, God called them, God wanted them, you'll find someone else, you're young yet, you're only widowed, you're 36 and widowed. Oh my goodness, there's a tremendous list of the wrong thing to say. So,
In fact, that reminds me, I was a chaplain at Miami Children's Hospital, which is where I met Dr. Tarr, who was a psychologist at Miami Children's. And at that time, my colleagues were saying to me, I could never do that work because I wouldn't know what to say.
Yes.
Right? Because they think that if you got a formula, if you got like maybe a scripture or something that you could say appropriately, and it's not so much about what to say, it's about listening and companioning.
That's right. It is the co-journey. It is the co-journey with someone. The socialization and the compassion are more healing than anything you're going to think of saying. But you can't even be there with anyone in the form you'd like to, where you feel confident if you don't know anything.
Right.
And if you think
Right.
that you
Yeah.
can use your grief work, which is your grief work and is not some kind of blueprint for anyone else's grief work.
Right. So
You're
that's
not
right.
the same person. The deaths aren't the same.
That's one of the first things I learned was to not
Yeah. Don't confuse them.
is to not say I know how you feel.
Yeah.
Because,
No.
right, everybody's different.
No,
Right? Yeah.
that, and you know, when you're with people of your own profession, you have to even be more careful because they've all been trained differently, and you want to just sit and listen. Most of the time, you don't want to say anything because a lot of them have techniques that they think are going to work. No technique is going to take out the pain of loss. It can make you feel better for a while or at the moment, but you're going to have to do your mental work. That requires cognitions.
Now, over the centuries, the church, of whatever faith you're in, has provided, some form of grief support through ritual, through the
I'm
funeral,
a ritual person. I believe in
the
rituals.
funeral, the burial, the lighting of a candle,
Yeah.
memorial service.
Absolutely.
These are things that are what we call mourning, as opposed to grief work, right? And in our basic grief training, we discuss grief as a normal emotional reaction to loss, while mourning is the cultural expression of grief, right?
Okay.
And why is mourning so important? And what harm is there if we fail to transform our grief into mourning?
Okay. We say or think in terms of the word bereavement means a state of being in loss. You're in bereavement when you've had a loss. All those folks over there are in bereavement, all of them. They've all had a loss.
At Surfside.
Yeah, they've all had a loss.
Yes.
Grief is the reaction to that loss, to that trauma, to that person who's died. This is my reaction, grief. I'm in grief now. Mourning is a psychosocial action that we take in order to heal the grief. If I stop with just grief, let's say I stop with just grief. So now all I can tell you is that I've had this loss. 20 years later, I can still be one of the walking wounded.
Right. Now, at Surfside and also at Marjorie Douglas School,
Yeah.
I remember going up there afterwards, and there was a fence
With
there
the
were just lines
flowers
of
and
flowers and
pictures.
names and pictures and right.
Yeah.
So that's an action. So that's mourning. That's a concrete action that people are taking.
I have an angel tree. You know, most people walk in here and say, "Oh, you still have your Christmas tree up." I said, "My Christmas tree is 10 foot. This is only 5, and it has only angels on it." And a couple of people have put all their sons' portrait and everything on there. So, I'm a person who's always believed in rituals. I believe in poetry, songs, whatever. I believe in albums. I believe if you know you're dying. I have people who have come here and they're dying. They knew they were dying. And we've done books for the kids who are younger, so that when they die, they'll be able to have that book, letters that they've written to that child, pictures, things that are meaningful that they've constructed during that year they've been dying with me.
Yeah.
That would be mourning.
yeah,
They're
right.
already mourning their death.
Right.
That's not grief.
And sometimes planting a tree in a
Yes.
memorial garden.
Stars.
Or
You can name a star.
Yeah.
You can plant a tree.
So some therapists are now saying that recovery from trauma is a spiritual journey. Do you agree with that, and how so?
Wow. Well, I think it's a psychological, emotional, physiological, spiritual journey.
Yeah.
I think it requires an integration of all of those things. I think you have a broken heart. You have a broken heart. We look at the heart as a symbol of our feelings. And I don't believe that if one does just one part of it, that one is necessarily whole. Mm-hmm. For me, it's not being asymptomatic, not being free of symptoms that tells me somebody is well. Someone is well when they have been able to return to a meaningful life that they say is meaningful, and they're able to manage their bereavement, their grief. Mm-hmm. That to me would be a wholeness. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can have, I think there are plenty of people that spout.
Right. It's not just
scripture.
A spiritual journey,
no.
It's a holistic,
no.
multi-dimensional
That's right.
journey. Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
That's my thinking.
Right. Well, do you have any...
That's personal, by the way.
Well...
That's personal more than...
Yeah,
I'm not giving that as a prescription.
Do you have any suggestions for volunteer chaplains and faith leaders as we engage parishioners who are traumatized in their grief? How can we help?
You know, in the beginning I would send out little messages thinking about you, you know, just little things. The person that knows the person, or just a little card that says, we're praying for you. Mm-hmm. You know, whatever is something that's okay with that particular dimension, whoever. And then when I had something going, I would have someone call and ask, could I come personally and visit with you for 15 minutes? Mm-hmm. I'd actually give a time thing. Mm-hmm. I'd introduce myself and I'd say, I'll be coming with so-and-so. So if it's a woman, mm-hmm. I'd always come with a woman. And if it's a man, I'd always come with a woman. In other words, I would have a couple that would come, mm-hmm. two people. And then they can invite that person. They can invite that person. And never give up on inviting people. Mm-hmm. Never give up. Because just because they're not doing something right now doesn't mean that they won't come at a different time. Just continue to reach out.
Some people say that if you say, well, if you need anything, call.
Never. I think that's the worst possible thing to say. You know, I think they need something. What they need, they don't know. They're not at a place of knowing what they need. They're in too much pain. Mm-hmm. And I also think asking someone, would it be okay if I pray with you? Could I pray? And I would say something very short. And I would not get into anything deep. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to bring any kind of book or anything, bring a little table, something that has little inspirational things that someone doesn't have to read anything much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We're hoping that we can do some grief training for faith leaders, for volunteer chaplains, and one of the missions of Share Your Heart and as well Global Grief Support and Crossroads, we have a common mission in the sense of training people so that there are resources in the community that are there.
In place.
So, right, and one of the values that we found in chaplaincy was if I'm as a chaplain, I know that I'm dealing in the hospital with somebody who's had a loss, and they're going out to Homestead or they're going to Doral. I'm not there, but I do know that we trained some people in Homestead, or we trained some people at this church in Doral, and I can make a referral, right? Mm-hmm. So what our goal was to set up ahead of time a network of grief support groups in faith communities so that we could refer
to different places.
to different places. And Share Your Heart does the same thing with the volunteer chaplains in terms of responding to urgent needs like food, disaster, that type of thing. What we would like to do is we would like to build some resources in these different faith communities, training volunteer chaplains and faith leaders so that when somebody from Surfside or any disaster or any grief or loss shows up at your place of worship, you have people there that are ready to respond, to listen, to offer comfort, and to do co-journeying, or what we call companioning. So we're getting set up to offer some workshops in that area, and I hope that people seeing this will respond, and will contact Share Your Heart and find out when we can get involved in doing workshops. So I want to thank Dr. Tarr for being with me for this interview today. And you had mentioned that there are a couple books that you recommend for reading.
I love those two books.
This is for you as the helper,
Yes.
not necessarily the one who's grieving. But
Absolutely.
And the first one, or if you want to introduce it.
The Ways of the Desert, which I love, and that's William Craft's book. I love it because it has a developmental model, and he's very much in favor of having therapy. He's not a person against therapy, but this is very much a spiritual book.
And I looked this up on Amazon and I saw several books with the title Ways of the Desert, so make sure that it's the one that
William
says
Craft.
Becoming Holy Through Difficult Times, William Craft. And then the other one was Awakening from Grief.
Okay, this book is not for me a spiritual book. It is more, first of all, it takes the years like the 60s, the 70s, and 80s and 90s, which I like, and it talks about how death was treated. Very easy read. You don't have to know anything about anything to read this book. And his whole mission was to help you find joy. Well, I'll be honest with you. I'm always suspicious of anyone who doesn't want to grieve 3/4 of the pages and put joy in 3/4 of the pages and grief in 1/4. I like books on bereavement that have 3/4 of suffering because they're real. But this is a book for the helper, because what it does, it talks about how we grow up and how we feel about grief. And I think it's important as the helper to understand that basic understanding of where grief comes from that we all humanly share. And I would recommend it. It's easy read.
And that's Awakening from Grief by John Welshans.
Yeah.
And
Not spiritual, not a spiritual book.
right.
I shouldn't really say that, but
Right, but this one is.
Yes, 100%.
This is definitely spiritual.
100%.
Ways of the Desert. And I thank you again, Dr. Tarr. We say Teddy, Dr. Teddy Tarr, for this sharing this time today, and also a shout out, a word of encouragement and thanks to all of you who are doing the work. You have, as Teddy says, you have guts.
yeah. It takes guts.
You have compassion.
And you're going to have hunger.
You're
going to want to learn.
You'll
more.
want to learn more about this. So thank you so much, and God bless you all.
Thank you for inviting me.